The system that powers almost every building on Earth was invented by a man who died so poor that strangers had to pay for the room he died in. His name was Nikola Tesla. On the morning of January 8, 1943, a maid named Alice Monaghan ignored the Do Not Disturb sign that had hung on the door of room 3327 for 2 full days, let herself in, and found him. 33 floors above the street, 86 years old, gaunt and wasted, little more than skin stretched over bone. A heart that had run too hard for too long had stopped in the night. There was no one in the room with him, only the pigeons he fed at the window. He had died in the middle of an unpaid bill. For 10 years he had lived like this, drifting from one grand hotel to the next across Manhattan, kept alive by other people's kindness, leaving debts behind him at the Waldorf, the St. Regis, the Governor Clinton, and now the New Yorker. Everything he owned in the world fit into a few trunks. Some papers, a handful of medals in a drawer, one photograph of a friend, and a small sealed tin box he had handed to the staff years earlier with a warning never to open it because, he swore, it held a weapon powerful enough to destroy them all. The current that lit the lamp beside his deathbed ran on his design. So did the power in every wall on that street and in most of the buildings on Earth. Flip a switch tonight and you are using his idea. The alternating current that moves through the wires of the entire planet came out of the mind of the man who died in room 3327, unable to pay for a single night of it. You have probably heard someone try to explain that, and the explanation usually runs the same way. Tesla was a pure genius who got robbed, cheated by Thomas Edison, buried by greedy bankers, a saint of science destroyed by smaller men who could not understand him. It is a clean story. It hands you someone to blame and someone to mourn, and most of it is false. What actually happened is stranger, and it is far more interesting, because this man held a fortune in his hands twice over, money enough to make him the richest human being alive, and both times he let it go. Some of it was taken from him, but the largest fortune, an income that would have dwarfed Rockefeller and kept growing for the rest of the century, he signed away himself, on purpose, with a steady hand, and by every account he never once looked back. So the question this whole life turns on is not who stole Tesla's money. Nobody did. The question is, why a man who could see the future so clearly that he lit up the 20th century could not, or would not, hold on to enough of the present to keep a roof over his own head. And the answer turns his poverty from a tragedy into a clue to who this man actually was, which is almost nothing like the legend that grew up around him. To find it, you have to leave that cold hotel room and go back 86 years and about 4,000 miles to a village caught in a lightning storm. Chapter 1. A Child of the Light. He was born just after midnight on July 10, 1856, in a village called Smiljan, in what was then the far edge of the Austrian Empire and is now Croatia. His family were ethnic Serbs. His father, Milutin, was an Orthodox priest, a stern and bookish man with a temper and a library. His mother, Duka, could not read. She had never been taught. But according to everyone who knew her, she had a memory like a trap and a gift for building things with her hands, small tools and mechanical gadgets for the house, and Tesla would say, for the rest of his life, that whatever he was, he got it from her. There is a family story about the night he was born. It cannot be verified, and it survives as family legend rather than anything Tesla set down in his own writing. But the way a legend like that fastens onto a life says something about how the man came to be seen. As the story goes, a thunderstorm broke over the village during the delivery. The lightning was fierce enough that the midwife, frightened, called the storm a bad omen. This child, she is supposed to have said, will be a child of the darkness, and Tesla's mother answered her, no, he will be a child of the light. You can decide for yourself how much of that actually happened. What matters is that a boy who would spend his life trying to pull lightning out of the sky and hand it to the world grew up believing he had been born inside a storm. He was a strange child, and he knew it early. He had what he called, in his own writing, visions. When someone spoke a word to him, he would sometimes see an image of the thing so vivid and so solid that he could not tell it apart from the real object in front of him. A flash of light would fill his sight for no reason at all. Modern doctors who have read his descriptions think it may have been a form of synesthesia, tangled up with a nervous system wound far too tight. To the boy, it was simply how the world worked, and it was terrifying and useful in equal measure, because it meant that later, as an inventor, he could build an entire machine inside his head. He could picture every part, set it running in his mind, and even, he claimed, come back weeks later to inspect it for wear. He rarely needed to draw a blueprint. The blueprint was already lit up behind his eyes, and then, when he was still a boy, something happened that carved a wound into him that never fully closed. His older brother Dane was killed in an accident with the family horse. Exactly how has never been clear. Some accounts have the boy thrown, others have the horse striking him, and a few even hint that young Nikola startled the animal. But the family always traced the death back to that horse, and Nikola grew up believing he had watched it happen. Dane was the gifted one, the brilliant one, the son the family had pinned its hopes on. Nikola, still a small boy, was suddenly the surviving son, and he grew up in the long shadow of a dead brother he could never quite measure up to. He would write, decades later, that the memory of that loss made every one of his own achievements feel faint by comparison, as if he were always trying to be brilliant enough for two people. Some of his biographers believe the visions and the fear got worse after Dane died, a boy carrying grief he had no words for, watching pictures flash and burn behind his eyes. He was inventing almost before he could properly read. In the village, with his hands and whatever he could find, he built things constantly. He made a tiny water wheel and set it spinning smooth and true in a stream, and he remembered being fascinated that it turned so evenly, an early taste of the frictionless machines he would chase all his life. He rigged a contraption to trap June bugs, glued a group of them to a light spindle, and let their beating wings turn it, a living engine, until, by his own telling, another boy who liked to eat the bugs came along and put an end to the experiment, and very nearly to Tesla's appetite for insects along with it. He took apart clocks he was forbidden to touch and could rarely get them back together. He tried to fly off the roof of a barn using an umbrella and his own confidence, and hit the ground hard enough to be laid up for weeks. He was a child who saw a force in the world and immediately wanted to grab it and put it to work, and that impulse never once left him. And there is one small scene from his boyhood that he pointed to, again and again, as the true beginning of everything. One cold, dry winter evening, he was stroking the family cat, a black cat named Macaque, and in the darkness, he saw a sheet of sparks crackle out from under his hand, along the animal's back, and felt the strange snapping of static electricity against his palm. He asked his father what it was. His father said offhandedly that it was the same thing as the lightning they saw in the summer storms. The boy stood there in the dark, holding a cat that seemed to be full of tame lightning, and a question opened up inside him that he would spend the next 70 years trying to answer. Is nature a gigantic cat, he later wrote, and if so, who strokes its back? From that night, electricity was never just a subject to him. It was the central mystery of the universe, and he had touched it with his bare hand. His mind, meanwhile, was already doing things that unnerved his teachers. He had a memory that seemed to have no bottom. He could commit entire books to heart, recite long poems in several languages, and reproduce tables of numbers from a single reading. In mathematics, he solved complex problems in his head so fast, skipping every written step, that his instructors openly suspected him of cheating, unable to believe a boy could simply see the answer without the labor in between. In time, he would speak 8 languages, and all of it sat on top of that nervous system stretched too tight, the same one that showed him blinding visions and made a ticking watch sound like a hammer, so that his brilliance and his suffering were braided together from the very start, 2 currents running down a single wire. He nearly died more times than most people manage in a long life, and he kept a private list of them, because coming close to death fascinated him more than it frightened him. Cholera nearly took him as a teenager, and had already, indirectly, won him the promise of an engineering education. There were falls and fevers, a near drowning, a scald, a plunge into a vat at a dairy that nearly finished him. He came to half believe that some providence was keeping him alive for a purpose he had not yet served. Whether that was destiny talking or simply the voice of a boy who kept surviving, it fed the thing the dead brother had planted in him, a sense that he owed the world something enormous, that an ordinary life would be a kind of failure, that he had been spared the storm at his birth so that he could one day do the thing no one else could do. Chapter 2. The motor they called impossible. His father wanted him to become a priest. Nikola wanted to be an engineer, and the two of them fought about it the way fathers and sons fight about a life, quietly and for years. The argument was settled, cruelly, by disease. Nikola caught cholera as a teenager and nearly died, spending months in bed, wasting away. At what seemed like the lowest point, his father, terrified of losing a second son, promised him that if he lived, he could go to the best engineering school in the world. Tesla later said the promise pulled him back from the edge. He lived, and he went. He landed at the Polytechnic in Graz in Austria, and for a while he burned brighter than anyone had ever seen. He studied like a man possessed, sleeping only a few hours, working through the night, terrifying his professors with how much he could hold in his head. And it was there, in a lecture hall in Graz, that he first collided with the idea that would define his entire life. The professor was demonstrating a direct current motor, a Graham dynamo, and the machine had a problem that everyone in the field simply accepted. It sparked. Direct current, the kind Edison would later champion, flows in one direction only, and to make a motor run on it, you needed a device called a commutator, a set of brushes that scraped against the spinning parts, and those brushes threw off sparks and wore down, and made the whole thing loud and inefficient and a little bit dangerous. Young Tesla stood up in the lecture and suggested, out loud, in front of everyone, that you could get rid of the commutator entirely, that you could build a motor that ran on alternating current, the kind that reverses direction many times a second, and do away with the sparking brushes altogether. His professor, a man named Poschel, more or less laughed at him. He told the class that this was impossible, that it would be like building a machine to turn a steady pull into a rotating motion without any mechanical connection, a perpetual motion scheme, a fantasy. He said it could not be done, and the thing about telling a young man like Tesla that something is impossible is that it does not discourage him, it marks him. From that afternoon on, the problem of the alternating current motor lodged itself in his brain and would not leave. He said later that he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he was right and the professor was wrong. He just could not yet see how. This is where the first crack appears in the clean story of the untouchable genius, because his time at Graz did not end in triumph. It ended in collapse. In his final year, Tesla fell into gambling, cards and billiards, for money, compulsively, the way he would later do everything compulsively. He gambled away his allowance, then his tuition money, then more. By his own account, he was pulled under completely. He stopped attending. He did not sit his final exams. And rather than face his family with the truth, he vanished. He let his father and friends believe, for a time, that he had drowned in the river near Graz. One of the greatest minds of the age, the child of light, hiding in shame from a gambling debt, letting people think he was dead. His mother eventually found him and, in a gesture that tells you everything about where his strange steadiness came from, handed him a roll of cash and told him to gamble it all away and be done with it, if that was what it took to cure him. He said the shame of that moment broke the habit for good, but the pattern underneath it, the total absorption, the inability to stop, the disregard for money as anything more than fuel for an obsession, that was not cured. That would run through his whole life, and it would help kill him in a hotel room 60 years later. Chapter 3. The Vision in the Park. For a few years he drifted. He worked as an engineer's assistant, moved between cities, took a job at a telephone exchange in Budapest. And it was in Budapest, in early 1882, that the moment came. The moment the entire modern electrical world can be traced back to. And it did not come in a laboratory. It came as something close to a hallucination. He had been working himself to pieces, 19 and 20-hour days, sleeping almost nothing, and he had a complete nervous breakdown. This was not a figure of speech. His senses became so painfully acute that, by his own description, he could hear a watch ticking 3 rooms away. The rumble of a carriage passing outside felt like it would shake him apart. Sunlight through a window struck him like a blow. He could feel the ground vibrate from footsteps far off. A doctor told his friends he might not survive it, and the friend who nursed him through it, walking him slowly back toward health, was a man named Anthony Szigeti. One evening in February 1882, the two of them were walking through the city park at sunset, and Tesla, who had memorized entire books, began reciting poetry aloud. The passage was from Goethe's Faust, a few lines about the setting sun and a longing to follow it, to lift off the ground and chase the light across the sky as it goes down. He was speaking the words as the actual sun sank in front of him, and then it hit him, not slowly, all at once, like the lightning of his birth. He saw it, the rotating magnetic field, the whole principle of the alternating current motor, complete, running, perfect, spinning in his mind. He stopped walking. He was so overcome he could barely speak. He picked up a stick and, in the dirt of the path, started drawing diagrams for his friend, sketching out in the dust the design of a motor with no commutator, no sparking brushes, a motor turned not by scraping contacts, but by an invisible magnetic field made to rotate by currents pushed slightly out of step with one another. The thing his professor had called impossible, drawn in the sand of a Budapest park by a man just recovering from a breakdown, at the exact moment the sun went down. That idea, that field turning in empty space, is the reason your home has power. Every large motor in every factory, every generator in every power station, the entire system that carries electricity across continents and into your walls, grows out of what Tesla saw in the dirt that evening. He would spend the next several years turning the vision into working metal. But the invention itself, the leap, happened in an instant, unfunded, unpaid, witnessed only by one friend and a sunset. That image already holds the shape of Tesla's whole life. The greatest idea he would ever have arrived as a gift, unbidden, worth nothing to him in the moment, worth a fortune to the world. He did not sell it that evening. He could not have. It came to him for free, and some part of him would always treat it as though it should stay that way. Chapter 4. Castles in Spain. To build it, though, he needed money and machinery and a country big enough to hold the idea. Europe was not interested. He took a job with the Continental Edison Company in Paris, the European arm of Thomas Edison's empire, and there he got his first real taste of how the world handles a man who is brilliant with machines and hopeless with money. He did outstanding work fixing dynamos and improving equipment, and he was promised a substantial bonus for solving a difficult set of problems at a plant in Strasbourg. He solved them. He came back to Paris to collect, and the bonus evaporated. One manager sent him to another, who sent him to a third, who sent him back to the first, each one insisting the money was someone else's to authorize, until Tesla understood that the reward had never really existed. He called it, in his own words, a castle in Spain, a beautiful thing promised in the air that turns out to have no foundation under it at all. That should have taught him something about the difference between what he was owed and what he would actually be paid. It did not. This exact thing would happen to him again and again, in larger and larger amounts, for the rest of his life, and he never fully learned to protect himself against it. But one man in Paris did see what Tesla was. Charles Batchelor, who ran the Paris operation and had been one of Edison's closest associates for years, watched this strange, intense young Serb work, and became convinced he was witnessing something rare. Batchelor told him to stop wasting himself in Europe. "Go to America," he said. Go and meet Edison himself, and he gave Tesla a letter of introduction to carry across the ocean. According to the account that has come down to us, the letter was short and astonishing. "I know two great men," it said, "and you are one of them. The other is this young man." So in June of 1884, Nikola Tesla stepped off a boat in New York City. He was 28 years old. The story goes that he arrived with almost nothing, a few coins in his pocket, that letter, some of his own poetry, and the diagrams for a motor that existed nowhere in the world but inside his skull. And even the arrival had the flavor of his whole future in it. On his way through the city, so the account runs, he passed a shop where the owner was struggling to repair a broken electrical machine. Tesla stopped, offered to fix it, got it running, and was handed $20, about a week's wages for a skilled man. He had crossed an ocean with nothing, and within hours he had earned a small fortune by doing effortlessly the thing that no one around him could do. That was always the shape of it. The genius was never the problem. The problem was everything that came after the genius. Chapter 5. The Edison Myth. He went to see Edison, and here we reach the most famous feud in the history of invention, and one of the most misunderstood. The popular story, the one in the comics and the memes and half the videos you have ever seen, goes like this. Edison, the ruthless businessman, hired the pure young Tesla, promised him $50,000 to redesign his direct current generators, watched Tesla work himself half to death to actually do it, and then, when Tesla came to collect, laughed in his face. "Tesla, you do not understand our American humor," Edison supposedly said. The $50,000 had been a joke, and Tesla, betrayed and disgusted, quit on the spot, and the two men became bitter enemies, locked in a war for the future of electricity. It is a wonderful story. It is the origin of the whole hero and villain framework that most people carry around about these two men. And most historians who have looked closely at the evidence think it is, at best, badly exaggerated, and possibly close to fiction. Here is what the record actually shows. Tesla did work for Edison's machine works for about 6 months, starting in 1884. He worked brutal hours and impressed people. He was set to troubleshooting the direct current dynamos and installations that were the heart of Edison's business, the same practical grind he had done in Paris, and by his own account, he redesigned 24 of the company's standard machines and improved them considerably. He was good at it, and Edison's people knew he was good at it. Whatever soured between them, it was never that Tesla could not do the work. If anything, it was that he could do it too well and wanted more for it than the company would give, and that his real ambition, the alternating current system nobody there cared to hear about, was already pulling him somewhere Edison's firm would never follow. The $50,000 story comes from Tesla's own autobiography, written decades later, and in his own telling it was a manager who made the offer, not Edison himself. The line about American humor, the specific quote everyone repeats, only shows up in later, embellished versions of the tale. And historians point out something awkward for the legend. $50,000 in the mid-1880s was an enormous sum, well over $1 million in today's money, and the machine works was known for being tight with pay and almost certainly did not have that kind of cash lying around to dangle in front of a junior engineer. The offer, if it was made at all, may well have been an offhand remark that Tesla took literally and never forgave. What we know for certain is thin. Tesla left the Edison Company around the start of 1885. In his diary, across the 2 pages covering the end of his time there, he wrote a single line, "Goodbye to the Edison Machine Works." That is it. No accusation, no drama, just a door closing. And the deeper truth, the one that ruins the clean story completely, is that Tesla and Edison were never really the great enemies of legend. They were different kinds of men who worked differently and disagreed about the future, but the historical record shows their relations were mostly cordial for years. Tesla, late in his own life, accepted a medal named after Edison. The real war, The actual bare-knuckle industrial fight over the future of electricity was not fought between Tesla and Edison at all. It was fought between Edison and a completely different man, an industrialist named George Westinghouse. Tesla was the prize they were fighting over, not the fighter. In the popular imagination, Tesla long ago replaced Westinghouse in that story, because a lone tragic genius makes a better hero than a wealthy businessman. But if you want the truth, you have to give some of Tesla's fame in that fight back to the man who actually waged it. Chapter 6. The Ditch. Still, something did break between Tesla and the Edison world, and after he walked away, his life fell apart in a way the legend rarely mentions. He was a free man now, with the greatest invention of the age locked in his head, and no one would fund it. He found some investors who set him up with a company, then lost interest the moment he started talking about alternating current, forced him out, and kept the patents he had signed over in exchange for stock. He was left with nothing, not a share, not a dollar. The man whose motor would one day turn the wheels of the world spent the winter of 1886 and 1887 digging ditches in New York for about $2 a day, laying cable and pipe in the frozen ground, by some accounts for the Edison company itself. He was starving, freezing, and humiliated, and he later called it a period of terrible heartache and tears, and said the work he could do with his mind mocked him every day he spent breaking rocks with his hands. The modern world came astonishingly close, that winter, to never happening. The one man who carried the working design for alternating current in his head was down in a frozen trench in New York, so poor he sometimes did not eat, so far from the laboratories and the money that a single bad fever or one careless swing of a pick could have ended it, and the electric century along with it. The rotating field that would light every city on Earth existed, in that moment, nowhere but behind the eyes of a starving day laborer the world had thrown away. It is one of history's near misses, the kind we never notice, because it did not happen. The genius did not die in the trench, but it very nearly could have, and nothing about his rescue was owed to him or guaranteed. He was saved, much as he would later be ruined, almost by accident. And then the wheel turned again, the way it always did for him, from the gutter straight to the mountaintop with no warning. The men digging alongside him and the foreman above them started to realize that the strange, elegant, exhausted man swinging a pick was talking about ideas none of them could follow, and word climbed upward until it reached people with money. In 1887, Tesla finally got backing to build the thing he had seen in the park in Budapest 5 years earlier. He built his alternating current induction motor. He built it complete, exactly as he had pictured it. No sparking, no commutator, an invisible rotating field pulling the machine around. And in 1888, he demonstrated it and lectured on it before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, and the people in that room understood, some of them, that they were looking at the future. Chapter 7. The War of Currents. One of the people who understood was George Westinghouse. Westinghouse was already a serious industrialist, a man who had made a fortune in railway air brakes, and who had bet his company on the idea that alternating current, not Edison's direct current, was the way to electrify a nation. His reasoning was practical and correct. Edison's direct current could not travel far. It weakened over distance so badly that you needed a power station every mile or so, an impossibly expensive way to light a country. Alternating current could be stepped up to high voltage, sent for miles along thin wires, and stepped back down at the other end. It could carry power across a state. What Westinghouse did not have was a good motor to run on it. And now here was Tesla, holding exactly that. In 1888, they made a deal, and this deal is the first hinge of the whole tragedy. Westinghouse licensed Tesla's alternating current patents. The terms, in the versions that come down to us, were around $60,000 in cash and stock up front, a comfortable salary as a consultant, and, most importantly, a royalty. $2.50 for every horsepower of electricity generated using Tesla's system. The arithmetic of that runs away from you, and Tesla apparently never ran it. A royalty on every horsepower of alternating current produced. As America electrified, as the entire country and then the world switched to his system, that royalty would compound into something almost beyond counting. It was, on paper, the single richest patent deal any inventor had ever signed. It was a stream of money that would flow for as long as the lights stayed on. It could have made Nikola Tesla the wealthiest human being on the planet, the first billionaire in history, richer than Rockefeller or Morgan, rich beyond the point where the number means anything. For a few years, everything went the way it was supposed to. Tesla was 30-something, celebrated, wealthy, at the height of his powers. And now the real war began, the one that was actually his to help win, the war over whose current would light America. Edison, watching Westinghouse and Tesla's alternating current threaten his direct current empire, fought back, and he fought dirty. Because he could not win on the engineering, he tried to win on fear. Edison's people launched a campaign to convince the public that alternating current was a killer, a lethal, uncontrollable force that would electrocute people in their homes. They staged gruesome public demonstrations, using alternating current to kill animals in front of crowds, coining the grim verb to describe it. And they worked, quietly and effectively, to make sure that the new electric chair being developed to execute criminals would run on alternating current, so that the public would forever associate Westinghouse's system with death. The first man executed in that chair, in 1890, died horribly, and Edison's camp made sure everyone knew what kind of current had done it. The man Edison's people used as their front for the killing demonstrations was an engineer named Harold Brown, who staged the public electrocution of dogs, horses, and other animals to drive home the message that Westinghouse's current was death itself. They pushed the branding so hard that for a while, in the grim humor of the day, to be executed in the electric chair was to be Westinghoused, the company's own name turned into a verb for dying. And that first execution, of a convicted murderer named William Kemmler, went so badly that it undercut the whole ghastly point. The first jolt failed to kill him. A second, longer application was needed while the witnesses grew sick at what they were watching. Edison's side held it up as proof of how dangerous alternating current was. It was really proof of something else, of how far they were now willing to go, because the engineering argument had already been lost, and fear was the only weapon they had left. It was ugly, and it was a measure of how frightened Edison was, because his side was, in plain fact, losing. Chapter 8. The most famous scientist alive. By this point, Tesla had become something the world of science had never quite seen before, a celebrity. In 1891, before a packed hall at Columbia College in New York, he gave a lecture that people would talk about for years, standing on a stage and passing hundreds of thousands of volts of high-frequency current across his own body, letting it flow harmlessly over his skin, while it lit lamps he held in his bare hands, turning himself into a human torch that did not burn. The next year he crossed the Atlantic and did it again, in London before the leading electrical men of Britain, and then in Paris, and the greatest scientific minds of the age came to watch and left shaken. Sir William Crookes, one of the most respected physicists in England, became a devoted admirer and friend. Lord Kelvin, the towering figure of British science, who had publicly doubted alternating current, came around and praised him. For a few years in the early 1890s, Nikola Tesla may well have been the most famous scientist alive, a tall, elegant, faintly otherworldly foreigner who stood inside a halo of artificial lightning and made the impossible look like theater. He had walked out of the world of engineers and into the world of legend, and he had done it in the way that was purest Tesla, by using his own body as the proof. Alternating current was simply better, and the proof of that came in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the great World's Fair that was meant to announce America's arrival as a world power. The contract to light the entire fair was the most visible electrical prize in the country, and the Edison side first proposed to do it with direct current for more than $1 million. Westinghouse, running Tesla's system, offered to do it for well under half that. Westinghouse won. On the opening night, President Grover Cleveland pressed a button, and nearly 100,000 incandescent lamps came on at once across the fairgrounds. More electric light than had ever been gathered in one place in the history of the world. People who had grown up by candlelight stood in a false daylight that stretched to the horizon, and all of it, every bulb, ran on Nikola Tesla's alternating current. Inside the fair, in the Great Hall of Electricity, Westinghouse gave Tesla his own room, and the inventor turned it into something between a science exhibit and a temple. He filled sealed glass tubes with gas and lit them without any wires at all, bending the glowing light into script that spelled out the names of great scientists and words of welcome, a cold and silent fire that was the distant ancestor of every neon sign that would ever buzz above a city street. He passed fierce currents over his own body and let them stream off his fingertips while he stood unharmed, the same trick that had already stunned London and Paris, a wizard in a dark suit, calm as a priest. And he performed the demonstration he called the Egg of Columbus, standing a copper egg on its end and spinning it upright with nothing but his invisible rotating field, no wire touching it, a solid object made to dance by a force no one in the crowd could see, the same force he had drawn in the Budapest dirt a decade before, now turning in front of the world. The victory at Chicago decided it. 2 years later, the system was chosen for the biggest prize of all, the harnessing of Niagara Falls. There was a haunting symmetry in that, and Tesla seems to have felt it. As a boy back in the village, he had seen an engraving of Niagara Falls in a book, that vast wall of falling water, and he had been transfixed, and he had told his uncle, with the strange certainty of a child who cannot know how right he is, that one day he would go to America and build a great wheel to capture the power of that very waterfall. It was the sort of thing children say and forget. He did not forget it, and neither, apparently, did whatever it was inside him that saw things before they arrived. 30 years later, on another continent, the boy's impossible boast came true, down to the waterfall itself, and he said afterward that he marveled at the mystery of a mind that could throw a promise that far into the future and then walk the whole distance to keep it. For years, engineers had dreamed of capturing the raw power of that enormous waterfall and using it to run a city. The problem had always been how to move that power to where the people were. Direct current could not do it. Tesla's alternating current could. When the Niagara power plant began sending electricity to the city of Buffalo, more than 20 miles away, the argument was over. Permanently, everywhere. The water that had thundered over those cliffs for 10,000 years was now turning the wheels of American industry. And a statue of Nikola Tesla stands at Niagara Falls to this day, because everyone involved understood whose vision had made it possible. What he actually accomplished is easy to state, and easy to underestimate, because the phrase powering the world slides past without landing. Before Tesla, electricity was mostly a way to make light, and even that only worked close to the power station. What his rotating magnetic field unlocked was the electric motor, a way to turn electrical energy back into motion, cleanly, quietly, at any size you liked, anywhere a wire could reach. That is the piece that changed everything. Once you can put a reliable, cheap motor at the far end of a long wire, you can run a factory that does not need to sit beside a river or a furnace. You can drive an elevator, and once you have elevators you can build upward, and the modern city full of towers becomes possible. You can tuck a small motor inside a machine in an ordinary house, and out of that comes the refrigerator, the washing machine, the fan, the pump, the countless quiet motors humming inside the walls and appliances of every building you have ever stood in. His alternating current, generated far away, stepped up to travel, stepped down to be used, and turned back into motion by his motor, is the invisible skeleton the whole 20th century was hung on. When people say Tesla powered the world, that is the literal, physical truth of it. He did not light a single room. He built the method by which power itself could be sent anywhere and made to do work, and then he handed that method to the human race. This was the summit. Right here, in the mid-1890s. Tesla had powered the fair, powered Niagara, become world famous, and he sat on top of a royalty contract that was quietly turning into the largest personal fortune in history, with every new mile of wire strung across the country. If the story ended here, it would be the story of the luckiest genius who ever lived. Everything he had suffered, the dead brother, the breakdown, the ditch digging, all of it redeemed, and a mountain of gold rising underneath him. Chapter 9. The richest contract in history. And then he tore it up. This is the second hinge, and it is the moment that decides the ending of everything. And like the Edison feud, the real version is more complicated and more revealing than the legend. The legend is beautifully simple. George Westinghouse, it goes, was in deep trouble. The war with Edison had cost a fortune. The wider economy had turned against him, and his bankers were circling. They looked at his books, and they saw one obligation more terrifying than all the others. That royalty contract with Tesla, $2.50 per horsepower forever, a promise that would grow heavier every single year as the country electrified. The bankers told Westinghouse that if he wanted to save his company, the Tesla royalty had to go. And so Westinghouse, hat in hand, came to Tesla and told him the truth. Your contract is going to sink my company. In the legend, Tesla listened, then walked to his safe, took out the contract, the piece of paper worth more than any fortune on earth, and tore it to pieces in front of the man. You have been my friend, he is supposed to have said. You believed in me when no one else would. You will save your company, and you will keep your business, and I will have my system. That is the story as it is usually told. And something like it did happen, though the dramatic scene of the ripping is likely folklore polished smooth by retelling. What the records more soberly show is that across the 1890s, with Westinghouse's company under real financial pressure from the fight it had waged, Tesla released Westinghouse from the royalty obligation. He gave up the stream of payments. He accepted, instead, a large lump sum, well over $200,000, a real fortune, but a fixed and finite one, in exchange for signing away the greatest ongoing income any inventor had ever been promised. Whether he tore paper or signed a settlement, the substance is the same. He walked away from the river of money and took a bucket instead. How much did he give up? No one can say exactly, and anyone who gives you a precise figure is guessing. The estimates that get repeated, that by the early 1900s the surrendered royalties would have been worth around $12 million, hundreds of millions in today's money, and growing without limit, are educated folklore, not audited fact. Some historians go further and doubt the royalty would ever have paid out in full the way the legend assumes, since the exact terms and the sums Tesla actually collected are murky. But the direction of it is hard to dispute. He gave away an income that would very likely have compounded for the rest of the century, and had he held on to it, the man who died owing rent might well have died one of the richest people who ever lived, with his descendants collecting on it still. Why did he do it? People have argued about this for 100 years. The sentimental answer is loyalty, gratitude to the one industrialist who had believed in him and staked everything on his system when the rest of the world was laughing. And there is real evidence for that. Tesla did feel a genuine debt to Westinghouse. But there is something else in it, something you have to understand about the man to understand the ending. Tesla did not care about money the way other people care about money. He cared about the work. He cared about the vision, the system, the idea made real, and running in the world. The money was never the point. It was fuel, a means, a castle in Spain he had learned not to trust anyway. What he wanted was for his alternating current to survive and spread and light the earth, and if giving up the fortune was the price of that survival, he paid it without apparent hesitation, and it seems he genuinely never lost a night's sleep over it. He got what he actually wanted. The world runs on his system. He just did not get to be rich, and he did not seem to think that was the important part. There was a philosophy underneath it, and he stated it plainly more than once. Tesla believed, with something close to religious conviction, that his inventions did not truly belong to him. He thought of himself as a kind of instrument through which nature revealed itself, and he felt the discoveries that came to him were meant for all of humanity, not to be hoarded and metered and fought over in courtrooms. It sounds naive, and in a hard commercial world it was, but it was sincere, and it explains a great deal. It is why he could tear up the richest contract in history without visible regret. The same conviction let him dream of handing the entire planet free power. And it is what makes him such a strange figure standing beside the other titans of his age, because while Edison and Marconi and their backers spent years and fortunes suing one another over who owned which spark, Tesla kept giving his sparks away and walking on to the next one. The men who understood ownership got the money, and often the credit. The man who thought ideas belonged to everyone got the poverty and, in the long run, the immortality. Both of those things grew from the same root. He was not a poor businessman by accident. At the deepest level, he did not want to be a businessman at all. He wanted to be a source, not an owner, and a source does not keep what flows through it. That is the difference between him and every other man in this story. Edison, Westinghouse, Morgan, they all understood that ideas without money die, that you have to build the machine that captures the value, or someone else will take it from you. Tesla understood the idea better than any of them, and understood the machine that captures the value hardly at all. It is the flaw that runs through him like a fault line, and everything after this point is the fault line finally splitting open. Chapter 10. The Wizard of New York. Because at first, giving away the royalty did not seem to matter. He still had the lump sum, still had his fame, and he plowed straight ahead into the most spectacular and reckless phase of his life. Through the late 1890s, Tesla was the most glamorous scientist in America. He kept a laboratory on the edge of what is now Greenwich Village, and it became one of the strangest and most wonderful rooms in New York, a place where bolts of artificial lightning cracked across the ceiling, and machines hummed at frequencies that made visitors feel awed in their bones. He wore the sharpest clothes, kept immaculate manners, spoke 8 languages, and gave lectures that were part physics and part theater. He dined nearly every night at Delmonico's, the finest restaurant in the city, always at his own reserved table, his meals prepared exactly to his telephoned instructions, his silver polished by his own hand before he would touch it. He was tall, well over 6 feet, thin as a blade, courtly, soft-spoken, with a slight foreign formality that people, and women in particular, found magnetic. The richest families in America competed to have him at their dinners. J.P. Morgan's own daughter, Anne, by more than one account, developed an obvious fascination with him and angled for an introduction. For about a decade, Nikola Tesla was exactly the kind of famous that gets invited to everything. And he seems to have been, underneath all the polish, almost untouchable. He never married. He never, as far as any record shows, had a romance in the ordinary sense at all. He insisted, when pressed, that this was a deliberate choice, that an inventor of his kind had to pour everything into the work and could not spare the part of himself a marriage would demand. Whether that was the real reason or a shield he held up over something more painful, no one can say. But it left him, for all his fame and all those crowded tables, profoundly alone in the way that matters most. And there is one relationship above all the others that shows both how much warmth lived in him and how carefully he kept it at arm's length. Around 1893, he was introduced to Robert Underwood Johnson, a poet and the editor of one of the leading magazines of the day, and to Johnson's wife, Catherine. The Johnsons became the closest friends Nikola Tesla ever had. He spent countless evenings in their home, exchanged hundreds of letters with them across the decades, and was folded into their family almost as one of its own. And Catherine Johnson, by every indication in the letters that survive, fell deeply and lastingly in love with him. She wrote to him with an ache running through her words, worried over his health, pleaded with him to visit more often, grew hurt and jealous when his machines pulled him away from her for weeks at a time. Once she sent him flowers, and he wrote back that he had never received flowers before in his whole life, and that they had produced in him a curious effect, which is either the most touching thing a man could say or the most heartbreaking, depending on how you read it. What Tesla felt in return is one of the quiet mysteries of his life. He was unfailingly tender toward her on paper, and he clearly treasured the friendship above nearly everything else he had. But he never crossed the line. He never let it become the thing she seemed to want it to become, and people have argued for 100 years about why. Loyalty to his friend Robert, the same fear of closeness that kept him from every other intimacy, or simply that the deepest part of him was already promised to the work and had no room left for a person. She loved him for decades, and he held her gently and permanently, just out of reach. It is the nearest thing to a love story in the whole life of the man who lit the world, and it never quite happened, and that near miss tells you more about him than any patent ever could. He had warm friendships among men, too, and the closest was with the writer Mark Twain, who loved the laboratory and would come to marvel at the sparks and the machines for hours at a stretch. There is a much-repeated story that Twain, testing one of Tesla's high-frequency vibrating platforms, enjoyed standing on it so much that he ignored Tesla's warnings to step off, until the vibration acted so violently on his insides that he had to bolt for the bathroom, with Tesla, one imagines, struggling not to laugh. Twain and Tesla, the humorist and the wizard, are one of the odd and delightful pairings of the age. But Twain died in 1910. Stanford White, the celebrated architect who would design Tesla's Great Tower and who loved him like a brother, was shot dead in 1906 in a scandal that gripped the entire country. One by one, over the years, the people who had filled that laboratory and those dinner tables fell away. They died or drifted off, and the man who had once sat at the center of glittering New York was left more and more alone with his machines, his memories, and eventually his birds. And in that laboratory, Tesla was pouring out inventions and ideas that were years, sometimes decades, ahead of anyone else alive. He was working with high-frequency currents, building the coils that still carry his name, the ones that throw those long violet sparks you have seen in photographs. He was making light without heat, the ancestor of the fluorescent and neon tubes that would later fill the world. He took some of the earliest shadow photographs, using a form of radiation, work that ran right up alongside the discovery of the X-ray. He had also become fascinated by mechanical resonance, and out of that fascination came one of the best stories in the whole history of invention, whether or not it happened the way he told it. Resonance is the principle that every physical object has a natural frequency at which it wants to vibrate, and that if you push it rhythmically at exactly that frequency, even with tiny taps, the vibrations feed on one another and build and grow until the object can shake itself to pieces. It is the same principle that lets a singer shatter a wine glass with a held note, and the reason soldiers are told to break step when crossing a bridge, so their marching does not accidentally match the bridge's own frequency and bring it down. Tesla built a small mechanical oscillator, a device not much bigger than an alarm clock, that could be tuned to vibrate at whatever frequency he chose. And the story he told, years later, to a delighted reporter, is that he once clamped this little machine to an iron support column in his laboratory on Houston Street, set it running, and went back to his work while it slowly built up resonance in the building's steel frame. According to Tesla, the whole structure began to shake. Then the buildings nearby began to shake, furniture crept across floors, windows rattled, plaster cracked, and alarmed people spilled out into the street, and the police, who had learned that strange reports in that neighborhood usually led back to one man, came running toward his door. Tesla, seeing what he had set loose, is supposed to have grabbed a hammer and smashed the little oscillator to stop it before he brought the block down, and then calmly informed the arriving officers that they had just missed a small earthquake. That story deserves some doubt, because the man telling it was, by then, a showman who understood the value of a good tale, and there is no independent record of Manhattan buildings dancing on his command. The runaway ending, a city block nearly destroyed by a machine the size of a clock, is almost certainly polished folklore. But the science underneath it is real, and the obsession underneath it was real. Tesla did build resonant oscillators. He did believe, in complete seriousness, that resonance was a hidden lever on the physical world, and he claimed that with the right vibration applied, at the right frequency, over enough time he could split the Earth itself. That claim, that a patient man with a small machine could find the planet's true note and crack it open, is pure Tesla. Half sound physics, half wild vision, and standing in the doorway of his laboratory, it was impossible to tell exactly where the one ended and the other began. And in 1898, at an electrical exhibition in Madison Square Garden, he unveiled something that genuinely frightened the crowd. He filled a large tank with water and floated a small iron boat in it. And then, standing across the room with a control box, touching nothing, connected to the boat by no wire of any kind, he made the boat move. He steered it. He made its running lights blink on command. He was controlling a vehicle through the air using radio waves, and to a crowd in 1898, this was closer to sorcery than science. Some in the audience thought there had to be a trained animal hidden inside, or a monkey, because the alternative, that a man could send invisible commands through empty space and a machine would obey, was too much to accept. Tesla called the boat a teleautomaton, and he understood exactly what he had made, because he said of it, plainly, that the crowd was looking at the first of a race of robots, mechanical men that would do the laborious work of the human race. He had invented remote control and radio guidance and gestured at robotics, in one demonstration, in a room full of people who thought they were watching a magic trick. He tried to sell the idea to the United States military as a remote-controlled weapon. They were not interested. They could not see it. Almost no one could see what Tesla could see, and that gap, between his sight and everyone else's, was about to stop being a gift and start being a curse. Because there was a warning sign already, and it had come a few years earlier, in 1895, and it should have taught him about the fragility of the thing he was building. In March of that year, his great laboratory, the one full of lightning and impossible machines, caught fire in the middle of the night and burned to the ground. Years of work, irreplaceable equipment, notes, models, experiments in progress, all of it gone in a few hours. Tesla, who carried so much of his work in his head, was able to rebuild more of it than most men could have. But some things were lost forever, and it was the first hard lesson that the physical world does not respect genius, that a fortune of ideas can go up in smoke in a single night, and that a man with no cushion of wealth underneath him has a very long way to fall. Chapter 11. Lightning in Colorado. He did not learn it. Instead, he reached higher than he ever had, and this is where the ascending arc of his ambition finally lifts off the ground entirely and heads for the sun. In 1899, Tesla left New York and went west to Colorado Springs, to a laboratory he built at the foot of the mountains at an altitude of over 6,000 feet in a place famous for its violent lightning storms. He went there because he had begun to dream of something that made even alternating current look modest. He wanted to transmit power itself, electricity, not through wires, but through the earth and the air, wirelessly, to anyone, anywhere, for free. The money for the Colorado adventure came, in large part, from one of the richest men in America, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, who put $100,000 into Tesla's company, believing he was funding a promising new system of lighting, not a bid to broadcast power across the planet, and possibly to signal Mars. Astor's own story would end 13 years later in the freezing North Atlantic, when he went down with the Titanic in 1912, one of a whole procession of bright, wealthy, doomed men who drifted through Tesla's orbit, backed one of his dreams, and then vanished, and each time the inventor was left a little more alone. He built a coil so large it filled a barn, a machine designed to generate voltages beyond anything ever produced by human hands, and he began, quite literally, to make his own lightning. The bolts he threw from that station reached over 100 feet into the Colorado sky. The thunder from his artificial discharges could be heard 15 miles away. Horses in the town reportedly bolted from the shock through the ground. Sparks jumped from the water pipes and the ground itself around the station, and butterflies, it was said, were wreathed in blue fire, their wings throwing off sheets of static. One of his experiments pulled so much current that it overwhelmed the local power company's generator, burned it out, and dropped the whole of Colorado Springs into sudden darkness. The power company was furious. They cut him off completely and refused to supply him again until he sent his own men to repair the damage he had done, which he did because he could not work without the town's electricity. The town, for its part, was learning to be uneasy about the strange man on the mesa who manufactured his own lightning and now and then took the streetlights with him. It is a small, almost comic episode, and it sits right at the center of the whole tragedy. Even here, at the peak of his powers, doing physics that no one else on the planet could do, Tesla was already the man whose grand experiments cost more than they returned, who blacked out a town chasing a vision he could not fully prove, and who left other people to repair and pay for the wreckage. The pattern held at every scale, from a burned-out generator in Colorado to a fortune given away in Pittsburgh, to a tower lost over a hotel bill. The genius outran the ledger every single time. He was standing at the center of storms of his own making, measuring, calculating, convinced he was on the edge of a discovery that would change human civilization forever. He believed he had proven that the Earth itself could be used as a conductor, that you could pump electrical energy into the planet at the right frequency and draw it back out anywhere on its surface. And one night, alone with his instruments, he recorded a series of rhythmic signals that he could not explain, regular and repeating, and he came to believe, and said publicly, that he might have received a message from intelligent life on another planet, perhaps from Mars. Based on what physics has learned since, we can reasonably assume those signals were some natural radio source, the kind of cosmic or atmospheric static no one in 1899 had the means to identify, rather than a greeting from another world. The scientific establishment, which had been growing uneasy about him for a while, took this about as well as you would expect. The line between visionary and crank is drawn by other people, and Tesla was walking straight across it in full view. Chapter 12. Wardenclyffe. He came back to New York in 1900, lit up with certainty, carrying the greatest and most fatal idea of his life, a tower, a single great transmitting tower, from which he could send not only messages but power, wirelessly, across the Atlantic, and eventually around the entire globe. Free energy for the whole human race, drawn out of the air like sunlight, with no wires and no meters, owned by nobody. He called it his world system. It was the most beautiful idea he ever had, and it was the one that destroyed him. To build it, he needed a fortune, and the fortune he had given away to Westinghouse was long since spent. So he went to the one man in America with pockets deep enough and nerve enough to fund a dream this size: John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the most powerful financier in the world, the man who assembled U.S. Steel and General Electric, a banker so mighty he had personally bailed out the United States Treasury. Morgan agreed to invest $150,000, several million in today's money, in Tesla's tower. And here, in the fine print, is the tragedy waiting to spring. Morgan thought he was buying wireless communication, a system to send messages across the ocean without cables, to beat the telegraph and beat the young Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi, who was racing to do the same thing. That was a business Morgan could understand and profit from. Messages are a product. You can charge for them. What Morgan did not know, what Tesla did not fully tell him, was that in Tesla's mind, the tower was never really about messages at all. It was about transmitting free power to the entire planet. And you cannot sell free power. You cannot meter electricity that anyone can pull out of the air. The whole point of Tesla's dream, the thing that made it magnificent, made it commercially insane. He was quietly building a machine to give away for nothing the most valuable commodity on Earth, using money from a man whose entire genius was for owning things and charging for them. On a piece of land at Shoreham, on Long Island, the tower began to rise. Tesla hired the most celebrated architect in America, Stanford White, to design it. It climbed to nearly 190 feet, topped by an enormous copper dome, a great mushroom of metal against the sky, with an iron root system driven deep into the ground beneath it to grip the earth itself. It was called Wardenclyffe, and for a moment it was the physical shape of the future, the tallest, strangest, most ambitious structure of its kind in the world. And then everything went wrong at once, from every direction. The costs ran far past what Morgan had given, because Tesla, dreaming bigger and bigger, kept enlarging the plan far beyond the communication system Morgan had actually paid for. In December of 1901, while Wardenclyffe was still unfinished, Tesla's rival Marconi did the very thing the tower was supposed to do. Using a far simpler and cheaper system, Marconi sent a wireless signal, just the letter S in Morse code, across the Atlantic from England to Newfoundland. It was crude next to what Tesla imagined. But it worked, it was done, and it was cheap, and the money and the attention of the world rushed toward Marconi. Tesla protested that Marconi was using 17 of his patents, and years later, in 1943, the United States Supreme Court would actually side with Tesla on important parts of that claim. But the ruling came the year he died, decades too late to matter, and by then the world had long since crowned Marconi the father of radio and moved on. That 1943 decision was itself a strange, sidelong kind of vindication, because it did not begin as anyone's tribute to Tesla. Marconi's own company was suing the United States government for using its radio patents during the First World War, and the court, looking hard at the history, found that the central Marconi patent could not stand, because the ground had already been broken by earlier inventors, Tesla among them. The recognition Tesla had wanted for 40 years arrived almost by accident, buried inside a lawsuit that was really about money the government did not want to pay. Tesla went back to Morgan for more money to finish the tower, and Morgan, who by now had begun to grasp what Tesla actually intended to build, who could see that this machine was designed to give away the very thing a businessman would want to sell, refused. There is a version of this story where Morgan, ruthless and clear-eyed, shut Tesla down precisely because he understood that free wireless power could never be owned or metered, and killed it to protect the whole system of paid electricity that men like him controlled. And there is a soberer version where Morgan simply saw a project running wildly over budget, based on unproven science, chasing a use case he had never agreed to fund, and did what any banker would do, and closed his checkbook. The truth probably holds a little of both. What is certain is that the money stopped. Tesla wrote Morgan letter after letter, pleading, promising, growing more desperate, and the answers grew shorter and colder, and then stopped coming. Wardenclyffe died slowly, which was crueler than if it had died fast. Tesla could not pay his workers and let them go. He could not pay for coal to run the machinery. He fell behind on everything. To keep the dream alive even a little longer, he did something that tells you how the walls were already closing in. Years before the hotel room, he began mortgaging the tower to cover his living expenses. Specifically, he owed the Waldorf Astoria, the grand hotel where he had lived like a prince during his glory years, a mounting bill for room and board, and eventually, that debt reached around $20,000. He could not pay it, so he signed over the deed to Wardenclyffe, his great tower, his world system, the machine that was supposed to light the planet, to the proprietor of the hotel, as payment for unpaid rent. It is the whole story in miniature, years before the end. The man who wanted to give the earth free power lost the tower that would have done it, because he could not pay his hotel bill. The tower stood silent and abandoned on Long Island for years after that. 190 feet of rusting genius, sparks flying from its dome once or twice, and then never again. And in 1917, during the First World War, with rumors floating that German spies might use the strange structure, the tower was wired with dynamite and blown up, and its metal was sold for scrap to help pay down what Tesla still owed. The single most ambitious object Nikola Tesla ever built came down in an explosion and was carted away as junk to settle a debt. The loss of Wardenclyffe broke something in him that the ditch-digging years never had. He suffered another collapse, a second nervous breakdown, the kind of thing that had nearly killed him in Budapest 30 years before. He dragged himself out of it, the way he always did, and he kept working, because the work was the one thing that had never abandoned him. In these years, he threw himself into a new idea, a bladeless turbine, an engine built from a stack of smooth spinning discs instead of blades, elegant and simple, and, he was certain, about to change the world all over again. It was genuinely clever. It drew some interest, but the industry had already committed to other designs, and it never delivered the comeback fortune he needed. He filed patents, sold consultations, chased licensing deals, and watched most of them come to nothing. Another long parade of castles in Spain. The pattern from Strasbourg, from the vanished bonus of his youth, had simply scaled up and kept running. Money was always about to arrive, and somehow it never quite did, and the debts crept higher every year while the great days slipped further into the past. Since so much of his ruin flowed from it, the question of whether the great dream was ever real is hard to avoid. Could Wardenclyffe have worked? On the narrow question, wireless communication, Tesla was completely right, and history proved him right, even if Marconi got there first and cheaper. On the larger dream, sending real electrical power through the Earth to be pulled out of the air for free anywhere on the planet, the honest answer is that almost no physicist today believes it could have worked the way he pictured it. The energy would have spread out and weakened and been lost long before it reached the far side of the world. His mathematics, by many accounts, held together inside his own assumptions, but some of those assumptions about how the Earth and the sky actually behave turned out to be mistaken. And still, he was not merely a dreamer chasing nonsense, because the smaller, truer version of his idea is now all around you. Every time you set a phone down on a pad and it charges with no plug, every wireless charger and contactless card works on the resonant coupling of electromagnetic fields that Tesla was among the very first to explore. He was right about the principle and wrong about the scale. He was right that power could leap across empty space, and wrong about how far it could leap, which is, when you think about it, the most Tesla thing imaginable. He saw a true thing, and then he saw it far too big, and the gap between the true thing and the enormous version of it is precisely the gap he spent his life falling into. Chapter 13. The Pigeons. He was in his early 60s. He had powered the world's fairs and the world's greatest waterfall, given away the largest fortune in history, thrown lightning across Colorado, invented remote control, and dreamed of free power for all mankind. And he was, functionally, broke, and beginning the long slide into the strangeness that would define his final decades and stamp the ending onto his story. Because as the money ran out and the great projects collapsed, the thing that had always lived inside him, the tightly wound, oversensitive, obsessive mind that had given him his visions, began to turn against him. The compulsions that had flickered his whole life now took him over completely. Everything had to happen in threes. He would walk around a block 3 times before entering a building. He counted his steps as he walked, and his laps as he swam. At dinner, he required exactly 18 napkins, and he would polish his silverware and glassware with them, one after another, before he would eat. He developed a horror of round, shiny objects, especially pearls, and could not bear to speak to a woman wearing them. He would not touch another person's hair. He became terrified of germs and dirt, washing his hands over and over. He calculated the exact cubic volume of every plate of soup and cup of coffee before he would consume it. What we would now recognize as severe obsessive-compulsive disorder had closed its fist around one of the finest minds of the age, and he lived more and more inside its rules, alone, in a series of hotel rooms, growing thinner and stranger every year. By now there was almost no one left. He had never married, never had children, and the friends who once filled his laboratory were mostly gone. The lightning was gone from the laboratory because the laboratory itself was gone. The famous dinners had ended. The money had run out years before. The choice he had made decades earlier to give himself entirely to the work and keep no room for a person had led exactly where a life like that leads, to a small room and a great silence. And into that enormous emptiness came the pigeons. Tesla began, in his old age, to feed the pigeons of New York, and it grew into something far past a hobby. He fed them in the parks, in front of the public library, everywhere he walked. He would go out at all hours, in all weather, carrying seed. He built up such a relationship with them that sick and injured birds were brought back to his hotel rooms, where he nursed them, keeping them in baskets, sometimes filling his room with them, to the endless despair of the hotel staff. He hired people to feed them when he could not go himself. And there was one, a white pigeon with gray-tipped wings, that he loved beyond all the others, and beyond, frankly, what most people can easily understand. He spoke of this bird the way a man speaks of the great love of his life. He said, in words that biographers have quoted ever since, that he loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and that as long as he had her, there was a purpose to his life. When she grew sick, he reportedly spent over $2,000, money he did not have, building a device to support her comfortably and heal her broken wing and leg. And he claimed, near the end, that the bird had come to him one final time, that a blinding light had streamed from her eyes, more powerful than any he had made in any laboratory, and that when she died in his hands, he knew that his own life's work was finished. It is impossible to know what actually happened in that room, whether it was vision or grief, or the two grown inseparable in an exhausted old mind. But a man who once threw 100-foot lightning bolts across Colorado ended by pouring the last of his tenderness and the last of his money into a single dying bird, and it may be the most human thing he ever did. He survived on very little in those years, warm milk mostly, and crackers, and a strange concoction of vegetables. His clothes hung off him. For years he had been moving from one grand hotel to the next, and the reason was rarely a mystery. He would run up a bill he could not pay and then move on, leaving the debt behind him, sometimes trying to settle it not with cash, but with the promise of a future invention. He had done it at the Waldorf, at the St. Regis, at the Governor Clinton, the hotel he had once tried to satisfy with a sealed box he swore held a weapon of terrible power, warning the staff it would destroy them if they ever opened it. When someone eventually did look inside, long after, it held harmless electrical parts. That was the shape of his money at the end: grand promises in sealed boxes, and a lengthening trail of unpaid rooms behind him. Chapter 14. The Prophet and the Death Ray. He slept only a couple of hours a night, a habit kept since his youth, and filled the long, dark stretches working problems in his head. He ate almost nothing. He stayed courtly and exact to the last, still dressing formally, still keeping his rituals, still measuring the volume of his food before he touched it. And once a year, on his birthday in July, he would summon the newspapers to his hotel and hold court, because the press still came, drawn by the strange old wizard and his impossible announcements. It became a small tradition of American journalism, the annual Tesla birthday interview, where he would unveil some new marvel, a weapon to end all wars, a way to crack the earth, a machine to photograph a human thought. The reporters wrote it all down, half in wonder and half in pity, and printed it, and the country read it the way you read a story about a man who used to be a giant. Even the honors, when they came, tended to arrive wrapped in irony. In 1917, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers offered him its highest award, the Edison Medal, a prize named for the very man the legend had cast as his great enemy. Tesla, who by then had every reason in the world to resent that name, is said to have very nearly refused it, then relented, and he stood to receive a medal bearing the likeness of Thomas Edison while a room full of people applauded a career the world was already busy forgetting. The press that had once called him a wizard now more and more called him something closer to a crank, and slowly, without quite intending to, the culture turned him into a character. The lone, brilliant, unworldly inventor, muttering about death rays and murmuring to pigeons in a hotel room, became the template for a figure you have seen 100 times since. The mad scientist of the movies, the genius too strange for ordinary life. It was a cruel exchange. The world took his image and flattened it into a cartoon, and at the very same time it took his actual inventions and wove them so deeply into daily life that nobody thought about them at all. People who had never once heard his name flipped his switches and rode his motors every hour of every day, while the man himself sat alone a few floors above the street, feeding birds, written up once a year as a lovable eccentric who used to matter. To be that thoroughly used and that thoroughly forgotten at the same moment is a rare kind of loneliness, and he lived inside it for 20 years, in plain sight, in the middle of the most electrified city on Earth, a city that could not have taken its modern shape without him, and had no idea it owed him a thing. And yet the strangeness was never only sad, because the mind never fully went dark. He kept announcing inventions, and this is where the ending gets its final, complicated shading. Every year, around his birthday, Tesla would call reporters to his hotel and hold court, and he would describe new marvels. The most famous was the one he called teleforce, and the newspapers called the death ray. He described a beam of charged particles that could, he said, melt the engines of aircraft and drop them out of the sky from 200 miles away, that could stop an invading army dead in its tracks, that would make war itself impossible by giving every nation a defensive wall no force could cross. He offered it to the American government. He offered it to other governments. He described it in convincing technical language, with the total authority of a man who had, decades earlier, actually delivered wonders that sounded just as impossible. And this is where the honesty matters most. No death ray was ever built. No working device was ever demonstrated. From the 1930s onward, the wonders Tesla announced grew more fantastic and less real, and the hard truth, backed by the people who later examined his papers, is that this final flowering of grand claims had far more vision in it than engineering. The man who had once seen a working motor complete in his mind, down to the last detail, and then built exactly that, was now describing weapons and machines that lived, as far as anyone can prove, only in the announcement. Whether that was the last light of a great imagination still reaching, or the fog of an old and failing mind, or some braid of both, is a question you can weigh for yourself. What the evidence supports is that the miracles had stopped coming even as the promises grew larger. And yet, it would be a mistake to write off that old mind entirely as fog and fantasy, because in the middle of these lean years, he sat for an interview that should stop anyone who thinks his vision had simply failed. In 1926, at the age of 68, thin and ascetic and living on almost nothing, Tesla described the future to a magazine writer, and parts of what he said are so accurate they are hard to read today without a chill. He predicted that wireless technology would one day turn the whole planet into something like a single connected brain. He said people would be able to see and hear one another instantly across thousands of miles, as clearly as if they stood face to face, and that the device allowing this would be so simple you could carry it in a pocket. He was describing the video call and the smartphone in 1926, decades before the transistor even existed. He went further. He predicted aircraft that would fly with no pilot aboard, guided from a distance by radio, which is a fair sketch of the modern drone. He described the wireless transmission of power and information as forces that would remake transport and communication beyond recognition. He foresaw a world where a championship game or the swearing in of a president could be witnessed live by people everywhere at the same instant, which is simply broadcast television and the connected age arriving right on his schedule. The man had lost his tower, his fortune, and most of his standing, and he was still seeing further down the road than anyone else alive. Honesty demands the other half of the ledger because the same interview shows the limits of prophecy, and Tesla got plenty wrong too. He predicted humanity would reorganize itself like a colony of bees, with women rising to rule over men, a forecast tangled up in the fashionable ideas of his day. In this period, he also drifted toward views about improving the human race through selective breeding, ideas that were disturbingly common among educated people of his generation, and that read as chilling now, and it would be dishonest to quietly erase them just because we admire his machines. He was a man of his time, as much as a man ahead of it. He held some beliefs that were wise beyond reckoning, and some that were merely the prejudices of 1926, dressed up in the language of science, and both poured out of the same restless, overheated mind. The gift and the error ran on the same current, the way they always had in him. The misses sit beside the hits, and together they make the shape of the whole tragedy clear. His curse was never that he could not see the future. He saw it more clearly than almost any person who has ever lived. His curse was that seeing the future and being able to fund it, build it, hold the patents, and grow rich from it turned out to be entirely different talents, and he had been handed a God's share of the first and almost none of the second. There was one more cruelty, a small one, that captures how the world had turned him into a kind of legend while forgetting the man himself. In 1915, newspapers reported that Tesla and Edison were to share the Nobel Prize in physics. It never happened. Tesla never received a Nobel Prize. Marconi had already shared one, back in 1909, for the wireless work that stood on ground Tesla had helped clear. Some later told a story that Tesla refused to share the prize with Edison out of pride, though there is no solid evidence the prize was ever really on offer. What is certain is that the highest honor in his field passed him by, while men who had built businesses on the edges of his ideas were decorated and enriched. On his 75th birthday, in 1931, there was a flicker of the recognition he deserved. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and he received letters of tribute from more than 70 of the greatest scientists and engineers in the world, including Albert Einstein. For a moment, the world remembered him. Then it forgot again, and he went back to the pigeons and the hotel rooms and the ledger of debts he could never clear. Chapter 15, Death and the Verdict, which brings us back, at last, to the cold room on the 33rd floor, and the maid ignoring the Do Not Disturb sign, and the heart that had stopped in the night. He was 86. He had lived his final decade at the New Yorker, in bills he could not pay, sustained by the quiet kindness of others. The Westinghouse Company, built in part on the patents he had once handed over for a fraction of their worth, had been discreetly helping to cover his hotel costs for years, and a small pension came to him from the government of Yugoslavia, the land of his birth. So the man who had powered the world lived out his last years, in the plainest terms, as a charity case, kept afloat by the descendants of the very fortune he had given away, unable at the end to earn or hold the price of his own room. And even in death, the strangeness followed him, and the world's fear of what might still be locked inside his skull. He had barely been found before agents of the United States government arrived at the hotel. This was the middle of the Second World War, and the men in charge were not going to take chances with the papers of a man who had spent a decade promising a weapon that could bring down 10,000 aircraft. The Office of Alien Property Custodian seized his belongings, his notebooks, his files, everything, and carted them off under guard, driven by the fear that his death ray research must not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands, perhaps the hands of the Soviets. His nephew arrived at the room to find the body gone and the papers already being taken away. The government put a brilliant young electrical engineer in charge of examining the seized material to find out what was really there, a professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named John G. Trump. There is a strange footnote buried in that name, one almost nobody noticed at the time. John G. Trump, the MIT engineer trusted to sort the real from the imagined in a dead genius's papers, was the younger brother of a New York real estate man named Fred Trump, which made him the uncle of a boy named Donald, who would grow up to become president of the United States. So the government's official verdict on whether Nikola Tesla's death ray was real was written, as it happens, by a future president's uncle. Tesla, who loved a strange coincidence and believed the universe was stitched together by hidden connections, might have enjoyed that one. Trump went through Tesla's papers carefully, and his conclusion when it came was quiet and final and, in its way, the last verdict on the whole long tragedy. He reported that Tesla's recent work was primarily speculative, that it did not contain the technical basis to support the weapons he had been describing, that there was, in short, no death ray, no secret in the trunk that could win or lose a war. The great final promises had been exactly that, promises. The papers were eventually released, and most of them found their way home to Serbia, to a museum in Belgrade that bears his name, where more than 160,000 documents are now held, honored, part of the world's official memory. But there was no hidden machine. There was only the long record of a mind that had seen further than anyone and, at the end, further than the physical world could follow. They held a funeral for him in a great cathedral in New York, and this is the detail that makes the whole thing ache, because it turns out the world had not entirely forgotten after all. More than 2,000 people came. Tributes poured in from around the globe. The Vice President of the United States, dignitaries, scientists, Nobel laureates, all sent their respects to the strange old man who had died owing rent. 3 Nobel winners put their names to a single shared tribute, honoring him as one of the outstanding intellects of the world. Messages arrived from around the world, including from the land of his birth, whose government had been quietly sending him a small pension in his last years, one more thread of charity holding him up when his own inventions could not. His body was cremated, and in time, his ashes would travel home to Belgrade, to rest in the museum that now guards his papers. The country that had let him slide into poverty and obscurity gathered by the thousands to mourn him the moment he was safely gone. It is the oldest and saddest pattern in the story of genius, the wreaths arriving after the man can no longer smell the flowers. And then, just months after his death, in June of 1943, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling on the radio patents and restored to Tesla, on paper, his rightful place in the invention of the technology that Marconi had been crowned for. The vindication he had wanted for 40 years arrived at last. He had been dead for less than half a year. He never knew. Chapter 16, Counted in Light. The afterlife of Nikola Tesla turned out to be stranger and grander than the last decades of his life ever were. The man who died unable to pay his rent was, within a few decades, honored in a way granted to only a handful of scientists in all of history. In 1960, the world's authority on scientific measurement chose his name for one of the basic units of the physical universe, so that the strength of a magnetic field is now measured in Teslas, and every engineer and physicist alive says his name, casually, dozens of times a year, most of them never once thinking of the old man who died alone with his birds. His ashes rest in a museum in Belgrade that carries his name, alongside more than 160,000 of his documents, an archive so important it has been written into the official documentary memory of the world. The main airport of the Serbian capital bears his name. And in our own century, that name was borrowed for what became the most valuable car company on the planet, an electric car company, which is almost too fitting, built on the far descendants of the very current he had given away for nothing. So the man who could not keep a single dollar in his pocket became, long after his death, a household word for the electric future and the patron saint of the lone genius out to remake the world. He would have found all of it gratifying, and beside the point in equal measure. The honors were never the thing he was chasing. He wanted the machine running, the power moving, the future actually arriving. The units and the statues and the airports are the world's late apology, an apology addressed to a man long past hearing it, and they do not answer the question his life keeps putting to us. So we come back to the question we started with, the one running under all of it. How does the man who powered the world die owing rent? And now you can see that the easy answer, the one about theft and villains and a robbed saint, is not wrong exactly, but it is small, and it misses the real and stranger truth. He was not simply cheated. Yes, the $50,000 bonus vanished, if it ever existed. Marconi took the crown that belonged to him. The world was faster to honor other men. All of that is true, and all of it hurt him. But the fortune, the real fortune, the one that would have made him the richest man alive, was not stolen from Nikola Tesla. He gave it away. He handed it to Westinghouse, on purpose, to keep his system alive, and by every account, he never once regretted it. He poured what remained into a tower designed to give away the most valuable thing on earth for free, and lost it to a hotel bill. The same trait that made him great. The total, burning indifference to money, the willingness to sacrifice any personal fortune for the sake of the idea and the vision and the work, is the exact trait that left him dying alone in a rented room. His genius and his ruin were not two different things. They were the same thing, seen from two different years. He measured his life by a different unit than the men around him. Edison, Westinghouse, Morgan, they counted in dollars, and they built empires, and grew rich, and are remembered as titans of business. Tesla counted in light. And by that measure, his own measure, the only one he ever really trusted, he was not a failure at all. He wanted the world to run on his current, and it does. He wanted to hand power to ordinary people wherever they were, and every wireless signal in your pocket is a distant grandchild of the boat he steered across a tank in 1898. A child of the light was what his mother swore he would be, and by that measure he kept the promise. He lit the century. He just could not, or would not, keep any of that light for himself. He kept giving it away, to the world, to the work, to a single white pigeon at the end, until there was nothing left over, not even the price of a room. Somewhere out there right now, in a wall near you, an alternating current is cycling 60 times a second, exactly the way a sick man saw it turning in the dirt of a Budapest park 140 years ago. It never stops. It has not stopped since. And the man it belongs to died so poor that other people had to pay for the bed he died in. If you want to know what he would have made of that, you only have to look at what he chose. Every single time the choice came to him, he chose the light over the money. He would probably tell you he came out ahead.